I think Khodorkovsky has handled his situation with tremendous grace and dignity. He is a man who is sort of at the top of his game. A decade ago, Russia's richest man, someone who decided it was time to support civil society, even venture into some opposition activities, and he clearly crossed wires with President Putin and paid a dear price for that. I think the fact that the European Parliament has nominated him for the Sakharov Prize speaks very highly of his image these days, at least outside of Russia. Inside of Russia, I think his image among some has certainly gone up. I think others, sadly, have probably kind of forgotten, and I think that was the whole point of this, which was to send him away in the hope that he would be forgotten. So I think that means it's incumbent upon all of us who have the ability to do so to bring more attention to his situation, to shed light on the fact that he's been languishing imprisoned for now just about a decade, has faced 2 charges and cases that most people have viewed as fabricated and spurious. There is concern that he's going to be facing a 3rd case this fall or next year, which I think would add to a level of outrage that many people feel. So, but I think throughout it all, through letters he's released, articles he's written, other opportunities he's had to get his views across, he's handled it with tremendous grace and dignity, and I think that's to be respected. Mm-hmm. I think his release would be more important and most important for Russia itself. It would indicate that opposition to the parties in power would not lead to someone winding up in jail. For U.S.-Russian relations, I think it would be a gesture of goodwill. It's something that I hope that the U.S. government will bring more attention to as the date of the anniversary nears. I don't think that the Bush administration did enough in bringing attention to this at the time it happened and in the years after, and I take some responsibility for that since I worked in the Bush administration on these issues. And I think it's important now not only for the United States but for European nations and for Russians themselves to make sure that they do everything they can to call for justice to be done and for these I would argue, manipulated charges and convictions to be dropped. I do. I was very supportive of Magnitsky legislation that passed through the Congress over the administration's objections. I think denying Russian officials who engage in gross human rights abuses the privilege, and it's a privilege, not a right, to travel to the United States to make use of our banking system is something we should stand for. It's as much about who we are as it is about who they are. It's a targeted measure designed to go after individuals who engage in this kind of behavior. It's not anti-Russian. In fact, I think a lot of liberals and other activists would argue it's pro-Russian. It's focusing on those individuals who are responsible for these kinds of abuses. It's not a blanket sanction. It's not against the country. And hopefully, sadly, I should say first, we can't bring back Magnitsky, but hopefully it will lead to officials thinking twice before we might see a situation that would lead to additional Magnitsky cases. I very firmly hope that we'll see passage of Magnitsky-like legislation in Europe. I think it's very important that this not just be a U.S. initiative, but that it be a transatlantic initiative to demonstrate to the Kremlin that this is something that democratic societies feel strongly about. I've noticed that in New York there's been action taken to seize some assets and real estate from a Russian official alleged to have been involved in the case. That demonstrates it has some teeth. It isn't just denying Russians the ability to travel here, but it shows that the justice system here is actively looking into implementing this legislation. I hope the U.S. government will significantly expand the list. There were only 18 names publicly released in mid-April. It needs to be a wider list, a longer list, and it should also widen its scope. And there were 2 names on the original list that weren't directly involved in the Magnitsky case, but it needs to widen its scope to cover other cases. If there's a 3rd case brought against Khodorkovsky, I would suggest that the officials involved in that case be considered for inclusion on the list. We need to work together in speaking out about what's happening. It has to come from the highest levels of the U.S. government, starting with President Obama, who I think started to change course over the summer. I think it was the right decision to have canceled his Moscow meeting with Putin for, among other things, it wasn't the only reason, but because of the declining human rights situation. We have to see this from European leaders as well. The European Parliament and the Congress have done their job. The Congress passed the Magnitsky legislation. The European Parliament has passed several resolutions on Russia, including support for Magnitsky. But we need to see this from European leaders. I think we need to view other points of leverage that we have. Russia wants to join the OECD. Why should we let Russia into another rules-based organization when Russia doesn't abide by the rules of the OSCE or of the G8? Well, granted, it doesn't have formal rules, but also the Council of Europe.
WTO.
And WTO, where it's violating rules, although those aren't based on human rights considerations. I think we need to be much more outspoken. We need to find creative ways to continue to support civil society in Russia with this, amidst this worst crackdown in human rights since the breakup of the Soviet Union. Without question, the situation is worse since Putin formally returned to the presidency in May of 2012, with the attacks against NGOs, forcing them to declare themselves as foreign agents if they receive foreign funding and engage in so-called political activity, the banning of adoptions by Americans of Russian orphans as part of the Dima Yakovlev legislation, the recriminalization of slander, libel, increased penalties for protests, the recent attacks against the LGBT community and the propaganda, as it's called. If one talks about being an LGBT activist in Russia, it's a long list. The Navalny conviction, the posthumous Magnitsky conviction, I could go on and on. If we can't get worked up about what's been happening in Russia just in the past year alone, then I'm not sure what we can get worked up about. We really have to be much more outspoken. We have to stand with civil society activists. We need to point out to Russians the outrageous levels of corruption that exist among those in positions of authority. The cost estimate of the Sochi Olympics, for example, over $50 billion now. While the predictions of Russia's GDP growth this year have been decreased twice this year, they're spending $50 billion on these Olympics, more than the Chinese, more than any other Olympics that we've seen in history. The questions about those in the Kremlin and close to the Kremlin and how they've accumulated their wealth, all those things we really need to shed more light on and support the civil society activists in Russia, lend the moral support to the Khodorkovskys in Russia, and demand justice for the indignities and the abuses that have been committed against the Magnitskys there as well. Where we have to provide support and shelter to activists who are fleeing. We're seeing more activists leaving the country, opposition figures, out of a sense of fear, out of a sense that they have to, for their own safety, find refuge. And so there's a lot we can and should be doing. I hope the President's recent turn in policy and meeting with civil society when he was in St. Petersburg and canceling his summit with Putin will reflect a sustained change in policy. I worry with the Syria situation that we'll wind up going back to where we were before, focusing on those kinds of issues at the expense of focusing on the human rights and civil society situation inside the country.